Well, hello, and once again, welcome to our musings on the story of David and Goliath and how it connects with the New Testament story of the crucifixion, as in the new is in the old concealed and the old is in the new revealed. In the other parts of our three-part series, in part one, we set the scene. We looked at the background and the context of the story. We discovered some links between David and Jesus, the connections that join the story of David and Goliath and the crucifixion of Jesus. We looked at David as being a type or a motif of Jesus, and then at Goliath, with him also as a motif or a type of Satan. We also considered the physical realities of the situation the Israelites found themselves in, how it was imperative that the Israelite army held their ground in the valley, otherwise the road through and over the mountains would be open to the Philistines, and the heartlands of Israel would be vulnerable to attack. And we also looked at the sling as a surprisingly powerful weapon, more damaging than arrows, with a longer range, despite the size of the stones that could be used, up to the size of a cricket ball, and highly accurate in the hands of a skilled user. In part two, the battle, we considered the two combatants themselves, their strengths and their weaknesses, and how they might apply to us today. We left David standing over the body of Goliath, having stunned him with his surprisingly deadly slingshot, then beheading him with Goliath's own sword in front of the opposing armies. The Philistines are now in full flight, hotly pursued by the armies of Israel. And so now, this time, we look at the aftermath of the fight. What did David do with the severed head he now holds in his hand? After all, he could hardly take it home to his father and put it on the mantelpiece. And what about Goliath's family, represented by the other unused stones? Remember those? The ones that David took from the bank of the stream as he went down to meet his foe. Now, after the battle, you would expect David to pack up and go back to the family sheep farm. After all, since being anointed king by Samuel, he's kept a pretty low profile up until now. But no, David takes the head of Goliath to Jerusalem. Now at that time, Jerusalem was not a Jewish city. It was held by the Jebusites, who were long-term enemies of Israel. The Jebusites were one of the tribes that the tribe of Benjamin under Joshua was unable to oust from the promised land. So maybe David, as king, although not yet crowned, felt there was some unfinished business to deal with here. By showing Goliath's head to the city of Jerusalem, David was in effect saying, "Look, this is what happens to my enemies, and you're next." Or in the South London vernacular that I grew up with, "Listen, son, your card's marked." This was a very definite threat. Although I doubt the inhabitants of the city took a lot of notice of a somewhat callow 16-year-old youth, and it was probably why David got away all in one piece. So what did he do with the head? He couldn't carry it around forever. He had to dispose of it somehow. Now, like today, burying something, in the same way as throwing a coin in the fountain, like in the Trevi fountain in Rome, was a declaration of an intent to return. He certainly would not have been allowed to bury the skull inside the city. So David may well have buried the skull outside of the city walls. And this raises the intriguing question of the hill just outside of the city walls of Jerusalem, named Golgotha, or the place of the skull. There have been many suggestions as to how the hill got its name. Some have suggested that Golgotha was a place of execution, in which case the name would be reasonable, as it would also be a burial ground. And sited next to one of the city gates would also be a warning to visitors to behave themselves during their visit. This gate could possibly be one called the Damascus Gate of today, which is built on the site of at least two others. Or even the newer, when we say newer, we mean 15th century, Herod's Gate, situated a short distance away from the Damascus Gate, under which they have found artefacts going right back to Jewish days. At a gate, people would have to squeeze and funnel down from a broad path into the gateway. And it's been suggested that tax collectors would count the people coming in order to raise taxes from the city businesses. The idea being that the more people that came into the city, the more money that would be spent in the shops and the markets there, and so the tax collectors could levy a higher rate of tax. They would therefore do a head count, or count the skulls at the gate. And the adjacent hill of execution might well have just taken its name from that practice. Another alternative is that today the hillside appears to look like a skull, and there's much photographic evidence for that if you wish to look it up using Professor Google. Now that may be so for now, but we have no idea what that hillside would have looked like 3,000 years ago, before 3,000 years of weathering has changed its appearance. A fourth proposition is that David buried Goliath's head here. That would not be such a great stretch, as at least we know that David and the head were there together at some time. And some have suggested that having buried Goliath's head there, that the name of the hill came from the contraction of Goliath of Gath to Golgotha. Now that linguistic trickery works fairly well in English, but it doesn't work at all well when it translates into Hebrew and Aramaic or Greek. But if David did bury the head there, and then returned to carry out his threat, it is more likely that it became known by that name due to the memory of David's actions rather than as a warning against bad behaviour, or head counting for tax purposes, the random weathering of a stone hillside, or by linguistic trickery. Whichever explanation you decided to take for yourselves, what follows we do know from Scripture. For 15 years went past, and during this time David served Saul, and sadly Saul came to hate David and to persecute him. And looking to kill him, Saul hunted David down and at the same time continued in his war against the Philistines. And we read that it is during this time that David twice spared Saul's life. Once when he and Abishai, the nephew we met earlier, crept into Saul's camp, took his spear and his water jug. And on another occasion, David, while hiding in a dark cave, cut off the corner of Saul's robe as Saul came into the cave to relieve himself. But eventually, Saul and 3 of his sons were killed in a battle fighting the Philistines. After Saul's death, David went to Hebron, where he was made king. But he was made king only over the tribe of Judah. And so the nation was divided, and civil war broke out, as Saul's remaining son, Ishbosheth, was still living and ruling over the other tribes of Israel. It remained like this for 7 years, until Ishbosheth was killed, and David was proclaimed king over the whole of Israel. Now I say all this to show you how long it took from the fight with Goliath through to him being crowned king over the whole of Israel. It took 15 years. And now David is no longer a ruddy-faced shepherd's boy, but he is a battle-hardened veteran, a king, 30 years old in his prime. Can you guess? What was the first thing that he did? Well, according to the biblical account, barely 2 verses after he was crowned king, he went to Jerusalem to settle an old score, to complete his unfinished business, to fulfill a promise made 15 years before to the Jebusites unconquered by Joshua. And I wonder if the inhabitants of Jerusalem remembered that day long ago when he came with a giant's head to promise that he would be back. Whether they remembered or not, David and his armies took and conquered the city. He made it his capital, the city of David, Zion. And in a sense, that's where the story ends. We have David, who is the Jesus figure, who conquers and defeats Satan, or rather Goliath as the Satan figure, and then wins back Zion, the city, which is a type and a motif for us, God's people. We are the city of God. But there is still a loose end. Remember, all those years before, when David walked out to meet Goliath, he crossed the stream, bent down, and selected 5 stones. And at the time, we queried why he might have selected 5. And at the time, we noticed that Goliath had 4 relatives. They may have been sons or possibly brothers, but the most likely combination is he had a brother called Lami, and then 3 sons, Ishbi-Benob, Sath, and Exadactylus. The name of Goliath's 3rd son isn't actually known, but he's been christened Exadactylus by scholars because it's the name for the condition that he suffered from, and that was having 6 fingers and 6 toes on each hand and foot. These giants, the relatives of the Satan figure Goliath, still fought against Israel. But it wasn't David, the Jesus figure, that dealt with them. It was David's mighty men who conquered these giants. David's mighty men, who we see listed in 2 Samuel 23 and 1 Chronicles 11, were a group of warriors that were gathered around David from his early days with Saul. He trained them. He taught them. He formed them into an army. They were his closest friends. They stood with him in battle. And between them, they killed Goliath's brother and 3 sons. Elhanan killed Lami, Goliath's brother. Abishai, who we know was David's nephew, killed Ishbi-Benob. Sibbecai killed Sippiah, or Sath as he's better known. Jonathan, another of David's nephews, killed Exadactylus. But how does all this relate to us? Well, Jesus dealt with the power of sin and death in the person of Satan. But Satan's family, the other fallen angels, 1/3 of the angelic population we read in Revelation 12, they were thrown out of heaven, and we now call them demons, and they are still working and active in the world, attempting to work against and undermine the building of the kingdom of God. That's why in the Bible, Satan and his minions are described as the enemy. David, having beaten Goliath, didn't defeat the whole family, but left the family to his mighty men. In the same way, did Jesus, in defeating Satan, leave the defeat of Satan's minions to his army, his mighty men, us? Were we not called to go into all the world? Is not the New Testament full of references to us battling our foes, the armour of God, the weapons of warfare? Is not our hymnary filled with fight the good fight, and so on? Is this not our place in the story? That we continue the work initiated by Jesus' defeat of Satan as surely as David's mighty men continued his work to defeat all of David's, all of Zion's enemies. But I leave that for you to decide and consider. I trust that looking at an Old Testament story and seeing the many parallels with the New Testament story of the crucifixion and beyond has fired your imagination to see and to wonder at how the Old Testament and the New Testament fit together in a complementary, integrated way. This is not the only Old Testament story that conceals such wonders. The story of Jonah, often maligned as a children's tale or myth, is as multi-layered and revelatory of the New Testament story as David's. Or the narrative of Moses and the release from slavery of the children of Israel expresses the entire gospel 1,300 years before the word gospel was used to describe the good news brought by Jesus. It is stories like this that underline the need for us to understand the richness of our scriptural inheritance. Otherwise, we cannot come close to appreciating the God who reveals himself so wonderfully in the Gospels and the New Testament. May I suggest, in closing, that Professor Martin Hengel got it exactly right when he challenged us right back in the beginning of part 1 with the thought, if all you know is the New Testament, then you do not know the New Testament. And so now, let me just say, consider these things, and in doing so, may God be with you.